This is Books of Titans, the podcast dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectuals, scientists, and others. We'll talk about what makes these books such classics and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about what makes them so important and influential. Today we're going to cover the book Hooked by Nir Eyal. As for who recommended the book, it was recommended by Marc Goodman. That is Marc Goodman at Future Crimes on Twitter, marcgoodman.net on the internet, author of Future Crimes, and a self-titled Global Security Advisor and Futurist. He's also the one who recommended the first book that we reviewed, The Inevitable by Kevin Kelly, which, as you covered before, was an interesting recommendation given Marc Goodman's particular proclivities, which you can say more about, Eric.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about in The Inevitable, but with Future Crimes, interesting book on how technology could be used in crimes. One that stuck out. Jason, you mentioned came straight out of a movie, but just even adjusting GPS a little bit on an airplane to where a pilot thinks he's landing on the runway, but he's actually it's actually negative 200 feet down, so he crashes right into the ground. Die
Hard 2, baby.
Yeah. So, but yeah, excellent book. It's getting up there in age now. I mean, within the last 10 years or something, but still a good one and one that was a good read. So, the author of this book is Nir Eyal. And he's got I like his website.
How about we say Nir Eyal?
Okay.
He's Israeli.
Okay. I like his website. It's nirandfar.com.
N-I-R.
Yeah, N-I-R and far. He's an Israeli and American author, educator, and entrepreneur. He frequently writes about how technology shapes our user behavior by creating new habits.
And that's habits as in like the things that people do habitually rather than like the things that monks or nuns might wear.
He actually defines it. He says habits are automatic behaviors triggered by situational cues. It's the things we do with little or no conscious thought. That's right in the intro there. So it actually helps set the stage for the rest of the book as well. He holds an MBA from a small California school called Stanford and a BA from Emory in Atlanta.
Emory's a good school.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get to the overview here. Now, this is, of course, a book that I did not read. Eric did read. So this is going to be one of our more interview-style episodes where I'm going to interview Eric about what he thought of this book on his read. So let's go ahead and start with the overview and initial reactions. Eric, what is this book about, and what were your initial reactions to it? Again, considering this for someone who may not have read this book.
Yeah, and I'm going to just start by reading a quote of his from the very beginning of the book where he says, "This book teaches innovators how to build products to help people do the things they already want to do, but for lack of a solution, don't do." So that's a great that's a great description of the approach of this book, and I found it helpful on two fronts. The first front was if you're in technology or you're an app developer or a designer, just a really a call to arms of sorts of how best to use that power on affecting behavior, because you can make people get addicted, you can make them do really bad things, or you can encourage them to do really good things, whether that's exercise or eating right. The other side of the book that I thought was really helpful was to view this as a consumer of these things, and maybe not just a producer, but a consumer. Here are ways that people can hook you, and as I put in my review of this book on the website, we have some of the top graduates. They're not going to Wall Street anymore. They're going to Silicon Valley, and they're trying to figure out ways to get you to stay on the website longer, so that the companies get more ad revenue. So you're up against really bright people trying to get you addicted and hooked. How how best can you realize that that's what's going on in a lot of the programs that you're using, and how can you protect yourself? So it's good on both of those fronts, whether you're a producer of these things or a consumer.
Let's get to a few favorite quotes then to start with, to get some indication of sort of how this book goes. So is there one specific or a few specific, are there a few specific quotes that come to mind for what characterizes this book or his insights in this book?
Yeah, one short one here is, to initiate action, doing must be easier than thinking. So a lot of the book follows this kind of just how best do you get people to initially get in. Once they're there, how do you keep them there? Whether it's reward system or something like that. So even with the design, even speaking to the design aspect on this quote, doing must be easier than thinking. So he would give examples of even Twitter and their iteration of their homepage over the years of, at first it was more complex than it is now, and really trying to get you to experience it and not have to think too much about doing it, just kind of diving in deep. So that was a good initial quote there that encompasses a lot of what the book is about. Another one, influencing behavior by reducing the effort required to perform an action is more effective than increasing someone's desire to do it. So even just the way you approach this, or the way that you try to get people to use the products or the app or the design that you're doing. Another one, Ian.
That one actually reminds me a little bit of a book we're going to be doing in a week or two, which is Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks a lot about basically the path of least resistance in terms of thinking and doing is generally going to be preferred because of a lot of different mental biases. So if you can find a way to make an action easier, then yeah, that goes along with those principles.
Yep. Next one, Ian Bogos, the famed game creator and professor, calls the wave of habit-forming technologies the cigarette of this century, and warns of their equally addictive and potentially destructive side effects. So the book definitely does not shy away from the harm that these things can do as well, but really tries to encourage the reader, whether they're a producer of this content or a consumer, to focus on the good things and the good habits that can be formed from the use of these technologies.
Yeah. Now, what are some of the ways that he emphasizes doing the right thing or shaping this differently? This is one of those things that I'm especially curious about. I mean, I know, like, Reid Hoffman, for example, the founder of LinkedIn, and investor at Greylock, and one of the early investors with Facebook and all this, talks about how when he invests, one of the things that he looks for is a company that basically encourages one of the 7 deadly sins. If the company plugs into one of those 7 deadly sins, then he's going to be much more interested, because he thinks that company is going to have staying power, because it's going to foster that sort of thing. So, he gives the example that Facebook, for example, plays into our vanity, LinkedIn plays into our greed, those sorts of things. So, and actually, here's a good quote from Hoffman on this. He said, the point is, you don't just want a trigger for user behavior, you want a hair trigger. You want to do this. And then he points out later in this quote, actually, he says, trying to rev up virtuous behavior is much harder to get started. So how then does Eyal how does he suggest that people actually plug into fostering and revving up virtuous behavior, when really it is a lot easier to just go and plug into the negative emotions or the 7 deadly sins? And you look at just how YouTube, for example, the algorithm at this point seems to be, there's a recent article, I believe, in The Atlantic, which we can link in the show notes, that talks about how it appears that the algorithms for YouTube, for example, are fostering more and more extreme stuff because it's more likely to keep people watching. Because if you give somebody something that's just slightly more extreme than the thing that they just watched, they're likely to keep watching, which then fosters more ad revenue for Google, which, yeah, that plugs right into the negative. And it's really easy to see how that negative can work with the with making things easy in that regard. But how does he suggest making getting to where we're actually doing it in positive ways?
Well, here's one example he has from a few different options with fitness apps. So the first fitness app had him change behavior. It had him start counting calories, something that he had never done before and didn't particularly care to do. And so instead of making him want to work out and count calories so that would help him with overall fitness, it had the opposite impact of making him just not ever open up the app. He compares that with another fitness app that just had him track what he was already doing. So he's not having to change a behavior. It's not making him think or do something wildly different than what he's used to doing. He does the same thing. So he does a run, but when he puts the run in, he gets immediate feedback from others, encouragement, and even a question. One lady writes and asks about knee pain and what he could do for that. And so the second option instead allows him to do what he's normally doing, but then create a community around that. So now he's connected to other runners, he's connected to other people doing similar workouts, and then the app kind of builds around that, as opposed to, hey, why don't you start doing some odd behavior that you've never done before, and we're going to call that fitness tracking. So that was one kind of neat example he gave on a way, just with a fitness app on doing that.
Which, by the way, these fitness apps, as far as diet and things like that, are still just, I've yet to find one that's even remotely easy to use. And I'm fairly technologically oriented, but I've yet to find one that actually I can stick with in terms of, meals and that sort of thing to keep track of that sort of thing. The person who does that, there's a market out there for that. If you can master a way to actually get that and make that easy, that now there's a market. But good luck with that. I haven't figured out a way to think that one through, and neither has anybody else yet. So I'm sure there's a way.
Do you think it might get easier once we're able to collect more information on whether it's glucose levels or different things? So like right when you eat something, you can see what it does immediately to your body.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of blood monitoring and things like that stuff is definitely coming, and there's stuff that's going to make that really easy. But in terms of nutritional stuff, in terms of counting calories or dealing with macros or that sort of thing, I've yet to find any. I've yet to come up with any sort of way that I can imagine that being made user friendly or easy. Because the problem is, yeah, I can plug in like what I get at, say, Chipotle or if I go to a fast food restaurant or whatever, I can plug in that meal pretty easily if they've got a way to find that. But the problem is, as soon as I go home and I have a sandwich, like how do I enter that? Or like I have a thing of spaghetti. Like how do they know what I put in my spaghetti? Right? Yeah. How am I gonna handle that? That becomes pretty tricky. So, they maybe could get some estimates on that, but I've yet to think of a good way to handle that. And like I said, if somebody ever cracks that, there's definitely going to be a market for that. But that's a little different than like the blood monitoring. I think some of that stuff's definitely there. But anyhow, let's get back to the book itself. Any other quotes that you want to get into before we move into some other discussion?
Yeah, one last one. Unfortunately, too many companies build their products betting users will do what they make them do instead of letting them do what they want to do. And that really ties in well with the fitness example we just discussed. But I even had a favorite word in this one. as well.
By the way, on that last quote, it's also interesting that that companies that do that actually sometimes end up pivoting, and it's the pivot that ends up being so productive. So you think about the iPhone. Apple had specific ideas. Jobs had specific ideas of what the iPhone would be, which was basically a little touchscreen computer that would double as an iPod, which is the thing I was most looking forward to. Is like, wait, I can combine my phone and my iPod because I carried my iPod with me everywhere, and then I could combine it with a phone. Like, that's all I wanted.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, people started building apps for the thing, and then Apple realized, like, wait a second, and they didn't even have like the App Store in mind. And then they realized, like, wait a second, we can curate this, take a cut of all these apps, and make a lot more money. And letting people do what they wanted to do ended up being more productive. Although Apple still does manage quite a bit. They've got a pretty heavy hand in terms of what Apple wants people to do, and they limit that. But the iPhone became what it became as a monster product, in part because of the jailbreaking community, which introduced an app store before Apple did. Yeah. So, yeah, there you go.
So yeah, it's good to keep an eye on those things to see how people are using them.
Yeah, no doubt. So yeah, you have a favorite word as well.
Reactants.
From this book. Reactants.
Which is the hair trigger response to threats to your autonomy. And a quote that goes along with that, but you are free to accept or refuse. By reminding people of their ability to choose, you give them control. So again, another example of just slight little things to do within the technology or the app to give people the sense that they are in control.
Whether illusory or not, I'm assuming.
Yeah. Another thing that popped in my head was
which, by the way, Apple. If anybody from Apple is listening, the ability to say do an easy middle click using your trackpads would be lovely. To be able to customize gestures more to a person's liking would be awesome. And just general, there's a lot of general power user stuff that I should have the ability to do, such as that, but you haven't enabled. And, Eyal's right here. If you just give me the option to accept or refuse your heavy-handed decisions, such as the decision to change every machine to the pseudo natural scrolling, which I have to reverse every time I get an Apple product. It would be nice if we gave us a little more autonomy on some of those things. But anyway, I digress bitterly.
I like it. One other thing that comes to mind is they talked about building in infinite possibilities and how that can also hook people onto the product. So you think of Facebook, part of the intrigue of Facebook is you don't know what you're going to see anytime you go there. I mean, somebody could have had a major event happen to them and you see it there first. Just that infinite possibility of there being something that not where you're expecting when you go there can lead to a lot of intrigue for a product.
Yeah, and actually, I think when I think of infinite possibility, the Facebook isn't the first place that I think of, even though it makes sense. I actually think back to some of the earliest video games that allowed some of that, like Grand Theft Auto, which is what made Grand Theft Auto so unique. Is it it had all these quests and different things like that, but generally speaking, nobody played it for that. Yeah. Right? You played it because you could find all sorts of just weird things to do in the game, and you could just go off and do your own thing, and find ways to try to get the entire National Guard and U.S. Army after you or whatever. I mean, there's all sorts of permutations that you could go for that had nothing to do with the basic design of the game itself. It was just a wide open world, and that ended up making that game so popular. Again, because of that addictive quality.
And you think of the complexity of that on the design side of it, though. I mean, if you got Super Mario, where you have to go. I mean, they would have a few things where you could.
You're on a line, right? Yeah.
Jump up, and go to World 5 from World 1 or whatever. But yeah, you go through and progress in a specific way. But from a design and development point of view, I can't imagine the additional complexity of opening up the system.
It's unreal. Yeah. So let's go ahead and get to a little bit more specifics. Any other details that you want to hit in terms of some of the interesting insights or case studies or examples from this book before we move into some criticism of the book?
Yeah, the one chapter was on a case study of the Bible app, and that's an app.
Which Bible app?
The Bible app.
Oh, okay. All right then.
No, I mean, there's one. I mean, if you look up Bible in the App Store, there's one that's I think they've had 100 million downloads of it. Yeah, 100 millionth install. So
wow, it's not one I use.
They had like first mover advantage and a lot of different things, and they're just constantly updating it and making it simpler, but then they have a lot of social connection points to it where it's easy to share on social media. But that was a great chapter because it was towards the end of the book. So you've read all these different examples, and then for him to go through what the Bible app has done through their history starting in 2008 was really fascinating. And yeah, I really liked that chapter. That was kind of the main case study in the book. Actually, the only one where it takes a whole chapter.
Huh. That's one that I'm actually kind of interested in picking up the book just a little bit to read maybe that chapter, which is intriguing to me.
Yeah, chapter 7.
Yeah, so that one probably worth it for those interested in that kind of case study alone. But before we wrap this, I do want to ask if there's any specific pieces of criticism that you had for this book. Anything in particular that you that you wish had been done differently, or you think could have been done a little bit better. What are your critiques of this book?
Yeah, one is that the examples that were used in the book were very predictable, to the point where he would start off a chapter and then you're already thinking, oh, this is a company that does that exactly, and then you would read on, and that was the company that he would highlight in that. And I think a lot of this has to do with just the some of the podcasts I listen to, and especially if it's a marketing one, it's really annoying to listen and for somebody to be asked a question and then their immediate response is, well, Apple did it this way. And so Apple is like the go-to for everybody. Everybody uses them as an example. And to the point where some of these podcast interviewers, they'll say, well, what about another company? And sometimes people have a hard time coming up with another company. But whenever a company is successful, it's very easy to point to them and as an example for whatever point you're trying to get across. But this book was full of a lot of the common examples, whether it's IKEA or Facebook or just it was too predictable. And I guess one of the criticisms is I just wish that he would have used some kind of off the wall ones, especially with, you're talking about an app store full of thousands and thousands of apps. I think could have had a few different examples other than the main companies out there. A second one, nothing really mind-blowing in this book. I know we've talked a lot about the power of kind of non-intuitive thinking that we've come across in the book, and those are some of the most powerful lessons. There wasn't a whole lot of that in this book. And then my last one's really, really kind of petty, but I love writing in the books that I get, and I love doing it at the end of the chapter. I kind of recap the chapter, and that's what I'll go back and look at.
Which, by the way, there's been some studies that have shown that is outstanding in terms of its impact on the ability to recall what one reads if you do that as a practice. So kudos to you for keeping that discipline, because it actually makes you much more likely to remember what you read than the norm. Again, that's one of the practices that is most closely linked with being able to remember what you read.
Well, and it also helps you when you pick up the book again, just to review it. It's easy. You just go to the end of each chapter and read the notes that you had instead of trying to go through everything you underlined or another method. But at the end of each of his chapters, he has a nice little tidy review for you. And so that it made it so that I didn't do my own. Everything was already there. So I missed out on that. I know that's petty, but it was almost like too much hand-holding. Like, just let me come up with my own review at the end of the chapter. And it was I put here, ironically, it was an example of reactance to me. And reactance being my favorite word from the book. A hair trigger response to threats to your autonomy. And these end of the chapter reviews were a serious threat to my autonomy.
Well, and actually, it sounds like with both things, with both of your primary critiques, they're related. One is that he would mention a principle, and you would immediately think of the example that he then went on to use, which then kind of took away a little bit of that steam. And then you would go to do your summary, and then he did the exact summary or something close to the summary you would have done. And then it's like, well, why am I even reading this? So
part of my question on that, though, was this book it's a national bestseller. And so a lot of people have read it. So one of my questions was, well, did I hear these examples on podcasts from people who had read this book and then just use the example? So I didn't know if this was if this was kind of the source for a lot of these examples, or if he just used a lot of the same examples that everyone else is using. So don't know that answer, but I had heard a lot of these examples before.
Yeah. Well, anything else that you want to hit before we wrap it up, or you want to go ahead and hit the conclusions here?
Yeah, let's go into the conclusions. This kind of, I guess, strange to say in thinking about a book on what I said at the beginning of it being a book for if you're creating the technology or if you're consuming it. A lesson I got out of this book was more on with these products being so addictive and a book being written about how to hook people into the thing. It makes it just more important for us as people to say no at the beginning of something. Because if it's so easy to get hooked into these things, it's going to be a lot harder to say no to something that you shouldn't be doing, or that's taking you away from time with things you should be doing, or even if it's just it's an app that you shouldn't be on. It's important to say no to those things at the beginning. It's important for those initial first choices. This is something that we've talked about in some of the other books, but that importance of saying no at the beginning and not allowing yourself to go into something that you shouldn't be doing, especially on the technology side of things. Because it's going to be a lot harder when these companies are getting so good at hooking you into doing something. So that's kind of a takeaway that I took from this book. And but yeah, maybe not a common takeaway, because it is more geared towards how to do these things on the technology side, or how to think about them on the consumer side.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is. I don't know that there's a whole lot of reason to spend much more time on a book that can be read in about 4 hours, but definitely a good introduction to a book that I think is going to be interesting for a number of people in the audience as a result of a number of our listeners as a result of the kind of demographics that we get. So yeah, I think that's a good place to wrap it, and that's going to go ahead and do it for us today. So once again, before we completely wrap, just a reminder, you can follow along with us in the books that we read at booksoftitans.com. You can interact with us on Twitter or Instagram at Books of Titans. If you haven't done so, you can also subscribe to this podcast, find all of our past episodes through iTunes, or Apple Podcasts as they're called now, the Android Marketplace, Stitcher, your podcast manager of choice, all sorts of different ways to get this. If you are enjoying the podcast, please make sure to give us 5-star reviews. Leave us feedback. It's always very well appreciated, and that sort of thing helps us move up in the rankings in terms of people being able to discover the podcast. Definitely share your favorite episodes on social media. We'll be back soon to discuss the next book, which we have not actually determined what that's going to be yet, but it's going to be next week. So, yeah. Here with Eric Rostad, I'm Jason Staples. This has been the Books of Titans podcast. Keep listening, keep reading, and keep improving.
And keep it real.
Thanks for listening. I made this.